Hey fellas, it's been a little while again since my last upload and I figured it was about time to break the silence and let you guys see what I've been working on during these long winter months. My name is Mikko and let me show you how to make a soft gizzard shad. Alrighty, let's get started with the bait. So every single lure that I always make starts with a design, and I actually designed this bait for a really long time before actually committing to this specific shape that you're seeing me cutting right now. Also, I didn't want to copy what everyone else is doing, so I opted to have a little bit more higher profile for this specific imitation. Since this is going to be a soft bait, I decided to go with the synthetic material called OBO Modulan or Obo Modulan. I don't know how you're supposed to say that, but I'm gonna have a complete list of all of the materials that I'm gonna be using on this project on the description box, or maybe I'm gonna pin it down as a comment. This OBO Modulan is a little bit too thick for my liking, so I'm gonna cut a little piece out of it. But first I need to mark where I need to cut, and I decided to go with 3 centimeters. And after that I'm just gonna score a line around the bait, and that's gonna be exactly 3 centimeters all around. I don't know if anyone can relate to me when I say that the hardest part of cutting anything is actually the start. And I don't know why this is, but it's always been the hardest part. I mean, after that I can cut pretty straight, but the damn beginning is always so freaking hard for some strange reason. I don't know, it's just one of those things, I guess. So now that the bait is at the right thickness, I'm gonna start shaping up the profile, and the easiest way to do that, of course, is to use a multi-tool. Usually when I do the upper profile, I kind of wing it and not do it very accurately, but this time around I decided to go on a little bit more accurate route and actually make a template of the upper profile. So in order to make a symmetrical profile on this template, I'm just going to fold the piece that I just cut previously and basically use the edge of that paper to trace out the other side, and that's how you get a completely symmetrical shape. Next I'm going to start working on the upper profile and trace out the taper that I want to have on this particular master. And I've already marked the center line to this bait, which helps me align the stencil a little bit easier. Okay, so now that I have the tail profile drawn onto the bait, it's easy for me to just use my saw and basically cut off the excess. And as you can see, hopefully, The profile that I decided to go with this particular master is kind of concave, so there's still gonna be a little bit of material left for me to basically get rid of later on. Like I mentioned, the tail has a slight concave look to it, so I figured the easiest way to get rid of that excess material would be to use my orbital sander. I know the camera angle is not the greatest here, but what I'm actually doing here, I'm slightly tilting the orbital sander and using the edge to kind of like gouge out the excess material. So I jumped ahead a little bit and started working on the head profile. And for this bait I kind of like wanted to have a blunt head. And that's kind of unusual if you want to imitate a real live fish, because since they don't really have a blunt head, at least not many of them. Anyways, the reason why I chose to do it like this is that a blunt head kind of pushes a lot more water and hopefully will translate into a better movement in the water. That's the theory anyways. We shall see if that actually ends up working out for me or not. But I'm putting my fingers and my toes crossed for that. Arguably the most important part of any soft bait is the tail, as it's the main source of motion. For this bait I've chosen to use a shutter tail, or also known as a vortex tail, which was first made famous by Huddleston and their Huddleston Deluxe Trout in 2005. Interesting thing about this tail design is that unlike a boot or a battle tail, it does not really cause the bait to have a noticeable belly roll or belly flash, and it just waggles from side to side. So in order to avoid direct copying of anyone else's work, I'm going to make a few modifications for the tail design. And the part that catches water, you know, the part that makes the bait swing from side to side, I'm going to make that more concave. I think that's going to make the bait to have a more delicate and more responsive action. Also, the tail profile is going to be slightly different on my bait. For example, on the Huddleston Deluxe, or even maybe the new Savage Gear Pulse Tail, when you look at the tail from behind, it's more of an oval shape, and I'm gonna go with something slightly more rectangular, you know, just to make sure that I don't get sued by anyone. So even though I'm going to use a multi-tool later on, I feel like using a knife at this point is much more accurate to get rid of all of the excess material that I need to get rid of before I can start using the multi-tool. That way I make sure that I don't screw up and take too much stuff out. Now I can start getting rid of the excess material that still remains on the tail. And as you can see, the guideline here is pretty concave. So I'm just going to try to transfer that concave look throughout the tail section here. And you know, just get rid of the material little by little, not going too overboard. Now that I have the tail pretty roughly shaped to the shape that I want, I'm just going to even everything out with some sanding paper. Next I started working on shaping the bait, and like always I start off with a knife and then finish everything off with some sanding paper. Again, to save some time, I jumped ahead a little bit and I already shaped all of these fins that I'm going to actually start fitting next. But first I need to make sure that they are nice and smooth. That I did a few years ago that had that shutter tail. It also had a kind of like a fat belly on it, so that's what I'm gonna start working on next. Now I need to make a guideline to help me carve out the fat belly, and I figured that the easiest way to do that would be to make a template, so that's exactly what I'm doing right now. Carving out the belly is pretty straightforward. I start off by cutting along the guideline that I just made here, and I'm going to start cutting from the opposite side of the cut, so that would be the tail section in this case. And little by little I'm carving out the material here and making the belly kind of accentuated. And you know, also this actually helps me with the action too, because I'm making the tail section much thinner. And like always, I finish off my knife work with some sandpaper. Now that I have the shape of the bait all sorted out, I am going to start working on the head details. And I'm going to start off by using this template to cut these little pieces out so that I can use to actually transfer all of the details onto the bait. And then later on cut along those guidelines and make this bait come alive. Now that I have all of the details transferred onto the bait, I'm going to start carving them out. And first I am going to cut along those guidelines that I drew onto the bait, and after that I'm going to start carving them out. Again, carving out the head details is quite straightforward operation. Only thing I need to be kind of careful is these very small parts like the mouth and some parts of the gill plate. Alright, so I'm done with carving the head details, and I'm now just going to start sanding these parts down. So I knew already in the beginning that I'm going to have protruding pelvic fins for this bait, and that's what I'm going to start working on next and making the fitting holes for these. Before cutting any kind of recesses for the pelvic fins, I'm going to draw out these guidelines for me to follow, and yeah, after that I'm just gonna start basically gouging out these small holes for these pelvic fins. So the fitting holes for the fins are not required to be very deep, so I'm just gonna kind of like use glue here later on. I'm just gonna make these recesses for the fins so that it's a little bit easier for me to glue them on later. So I jumped ahead a little bit again, and I already made the general shape of the pectoral fins, and now I'm gonna start doing the rays in those fins, basically the bones. To top off the carving work that I just did, I'm going to use my diamond file to make sure that everything is nice and smooth. Before I can start carving out the scales, I'm going to make this grid pattern to help me align the scales a little bit easier when I actually start to individually draw them onto the bait. And also I wanted to kind of interlock all of the scales with the lateral line. So hopefully that's going to work out for me and make the bait look even more realistic. I think here you can see pretty well what I meant when I wanted to have all of the scales interlock with the lateral line. And yeah, I think it does look a little bit better than compared to what I did before. So, I mean, lure making is kind of like this. It's kind of baby steps when it comes to your craft. So carving out these scales is pretty much a straightforward, same thing that I already did on every single other part on the bait so far. But yeah, I just cut along the lines that I made here, and then I'm gonna come from the backside, and basically that will make the scale lift up and look 3D. Here you can see how I'm coming from behind the scale, and the real trick about doing consistent scale work is basically to take a lot of breaks. That's what I always do. That's what I probably always will do. And it seems to work really well for me, and I'm able to get really consistent look throughout the bait. Now that I'm done with the scale work, and I've already done the recesses for the other fins, I'm going to start making the lateral line and just basically poking with my knife the small holes that will then simulate a lateral line. Next up, I'm going to attach all of the fins to the body, and I'm just using this plastic putty to attach these things on the bait. The good thing about using something like this is that it actually fills out all of the creases and crevices that you might have in a bait like this. After 10 minutes, the plastic putty has set enough for me to start scraping it off, and I usually just use my knife to get rid of all of the excess because it's like very accurate and just seems to work the best, I guess. But yeah, I really do like using plastic putty because at this point it's still really easy to get it off, but after, let's say, 30 minutes to an hour, this thing sets to be rock hard and it's really hard to get off. So again, little time has passed and I'm starting to work on the mold now. And what you guys didn't see is that I actually went and sprayed the whole bait black and then put some clear coat on it and let it sit for 10 days. Anyways, I'm gonna start filling out the mold box with some mold clay. And the mold clay that I use for this one is called Chavant Le Bon Touché, or something like that. My pronunciation might be way off, but I'm gonna have that full list of all the materials that I use in this video in the video description box or in the comments. I haven't decided yet. And since this is going to be a two-piece mold, I'm going to make sure that the surface is as flat as I possibly can make it with using these archaic tools. So I want to give you guys a little bit of backstory on the reason why I decided to go ahead and paint my master black this time around. And the reason for that is quite simple actually. It's way easier to see all of the defects that you might have on a bait like this, that you might want to fix later on. But thankfully enough, I actually didn't have any defects that I wanted to fix. So I just basically went ahead and clear coated the whole thing. Right, since this is going to be a two-piece mold, I'm going to have to excavate a hole to accommodate the other half of this mold master that I'm going to then bury inside the mold clay. I think I said this in my other videos that the parting line is the most important thing about a two-piece mold, and that is still true. It prevents a lot of the flashing that might occur when you cast a piece, be it from resin or plastisol, like in this case. And what I'm doing right now, I'm basically just filling out the holes that are still there. One reoccurring problem I always had with these two-piece molds, and whenever I pour plastisol baits, especially the big ones, is that whenever I do a lot of them in a row, the mold starts to get really hot, and that causes it to deform a little bit, which causes leakage. So we can't have that now, can we? So what I come up with is a plan to make a casket around the mold master, and hopefully that's gonna help with the leakage issue. I was talking earlier about the importance of having a clean potting line, and here you can see very clearly that there's no flashing to speak of, and that just means that I have less stuff to clean now, which is always good. Now that I'm getting ready to pour the other half of the mold silicone into my mold box, I need to make sure that it's not going to stick to the other half. So I'm just going to use this Man's 200 easy release to make sure that there's something in between those two layers and they're not going to stick together. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit again, and I've mixed a batch of mold silicone, and I'm gonna just start pouring it into the mold. But first things first, I'm going to make sure that there's no bubbles directly in contact with the mold master, and I'm just going to pour a thin layer of mold silicone on top of that. And I'm just going to wait roughly 10 minutes for most of the bubbles to burst, and then I'm just going to pour the rest into the mold. As someone who experiments a lot, I have a lot of these old molds just lying around and taking up space. And instead of them taking up space, I decided to actually use one of them and cut it up and use as a filler in this mold. So what I did was I cut up the inner part of that old mold, and I'm just going to use the outer walls of that mold as a filler. And of course I could have just cut them up into small pieces, but honestly, it takes a long time to cut it up by hand, so I just decided to use these really big pieces that are basically the outer walls of that old mold. So what I'm doing right now, I'm putting these riser bits inside the mold so that there's going to be a thin layer of like fresh silicone underneath, so those big pieces, so that there's not going to be any kind of detachment and tearing that might occur later on when I actually start using the mold. I've added a little bit more silicone into the mold with some cut up small pieces of old silicone, and I'm just going to place the really big pieces now on top of those riser bits. Once I have the old silicone pieces in the position I want them to be, I'm just going to fill up the rest of the mold. I usually use Mold Max 30 from Smooth On, and it takes roughly 24 hours for it to be completely cured. So now it's time to tear up the mold box and open up the mold and see what I got here. So because of the shape of the soft plastic that I'm going to be pouring, I figured that the easiest way to pour it would be from the tail section. So I'm just going to cut a small opening here, which is actually the same size as the nozzle of my injector that I may or may not use. I haven't decided yet, so I guess we'll just have to see and what will be the best option for this particular bait. In order to try to eliminate bubbles from forming inside the mold that then turn into holes, I'm going to preheat the mold with my hot air gun. So I already know from past experience that because of the angle of the pelvic fins, I'm not going to be able to fill them completely if I would just pour the plastisol in through the pore hole like I normally would. So instead I'm just going to have to pour them in while the mold is still open, and then just flip it and close it, and then fill up the rest, or actually not the rest. I'm going to fill up the mold 2/3 of the way because this is a fairly big bait, so there's going to be a lot of contracting going on inside the plastisol, and yeah, then I'm just going to fill up the rest after that. Also, you might notice the internal weight that I've attached inside the mold, and this is just a prototype at this point. I'm just going to use this as reference point later on determining how much weight I'm going to actually need inside this shad. And later on I'm probably going to make something a little bit more elaborate, probably have some sort of foam insert or something like that. I really haven't decided at this point yet. Also, one noteworthy thing that I want to mention here is that you should always wear some sort of protection, meaning gloves and then some sort of respirator that can filter out organic fumes, because plastisol is not exactly good for you. Now I'm just gonna wait 3 minutes for the plastisol to contract. That's usually enough time for any plastisol brands to contract as much as they're gonna contract. And after that I'm just going to fill up the tail section. After 20 minutes the first pour is ready to be demolded, and usually whenever I do these the first pour is going to be around 20 minutes, and maybe after 3 or 4 pours I'm going to up that into 25 or even 30 minutes, because obviously the mold is going to be way hotter and it's going to take longer for it to cool down. And if you make the mistake of opening the mold too soon, you're going to have plastisol all over your legs, and that's no fun. Alright, let's start painting. And like before, I use Cap Coatings soft plastic paints on all of my soft plastic paintings, so if you want to get good paints, go with Cap Coatings. And of course this is going to be a natural shad color, so I'm going to do my darnest to try to imitate a natural shad. So first we are going to start with silver. After silver I'm going to spray some white on the belly. Before starting to paint this shad, I pulled up some photos from Google and noticed that there's a noticeable kind of like a brown tinge on their backs. And of course, since I live in Finland, we don't have shad, so I can't really go out there and catch any reference bait, so we're just gonna have to go with Google images. So at this point of the painting process, I decided that it might be a good time to do the fins, and I made this stencil really quickly to help me cover any kind of overspray that might occur. Then I just continued on using other kind of stencils to cover up any kind of overspray that might occur on the other fins. I could have just left the back brown, but I decided to cover it up a little bit more with just using some black to just kind of like blend it in. So a gizzard shad has this spot right behind the gill plate, so that's what I'm doing right now, just freehanding it onto the bait. One last thing I need to do before the painting is done. I need to add a little bit more shimmer to the bait. And if you go to Google and see those reference photos, there's usually always a little bit of like blue shimmer on the top of their flanks. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm adding some blue pearl onto the bait. Even though these are, you know, prototypes still, I still wanted to add some eyes on them to make them look a little bit more nicer and give me more confidence when I go out and try to catch a fish with these. So I'm just about to head out somewhere around there, and first I need to get rid of this stuff here. So yeah, let's get rid of the snow, and I'm gonna be heading out there and testing out those shads, and hopefully they're gonna work. And away we go. Like a pro. Alright guys, I figured that you're probably not going to be able to see the natural color, so I made this yellow one, so it's easier to track it in the water. Still no pike. I haven't even seen anything yet. But at least the sun is shining right now, so that's good. I have a feeling I'm going to be engulfed with a snowstorm soon. That thing doesn't look very good over there, so. But I'm still gonna keep fishing. Still gonna keep trying. Crap, it's getting more ridiculous. It's snowing like crazy right now, and actually this is more like hail. Yeah, the joys of spring fishing, I guess. Yeah, this is ridiculous. There's a pike from shutter tail. Damn, that was a good pike, I think. Maybe 4 kilos. After that one pike that followed my shad, I did have 2 other followers, and unfortunately I wasn't able to make any of them to commit to the bait and actually biting into it. But you know, that's spring fishing sometimes, can be extremely tough. But regardless, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like the video if you did, subscribe to more content like this, and I'll see you guys in the next video.